part two of this lecture, I would like to talk about Tlingit people and the sort of all-pervading concept within Tlingit culture of balance. Before we get into that, I'd like to kind of set the stage by talking about Tlingit colonial histories, which will lead directly into talking about the furlough reading. So if you didn't do the furlough reading, Angoon remembers, I think it's one of the best readings we do this semester. Also, of course, one of the most tragic, but really kind of a critical reading in terms of how it sort of lays bare some really important concepts within Tlingit culture. So, stop the video, go do that reading from the Williams book. Okay, I'm going to assume you stopped the video and went and did that reading, so now that you're back with me, let's talk a little bit about Tlingit colonial histories, and then we'll get into the Angoon reading. So, 1741, as far as we know, is the first contact by Tlingit people with European people, specifically with the Chirikov expedition from Russia. You then have in 1775, this Chirikov expedition, by the way, they sent several people into Tlingit territory, and we're not really sure, historically speaking, what happened. According to Tlingit tradition, these people came and settled with the Tlingit people and sort of became assimilated into their society, which if that's the case, that actually would follow a long-standing Tlingit pattern where people of neighboring nations would sometimes become assimilated for one reason or another, sometimes by force, but oftentimes not, just for other reasons, would become assimilated into Tlingit society. So maybe you have kind of like a neighboring Haida group that, comes over into and becomes part of Tlingit territory. As a result, they kind of become a clan unto themselves. And so this was not uncommon for Tlingit people to adopt people into their society. And so that may very well have been what happened with the Chirikov expedition members, or not. We're not really sure. 1775 sees a brief contact with Spanish explorers. So people oftentimes, at least for me, I don't know how you are, but for me, my geography of how colonialism looked in North America as it progressed historically is often off, or at least it was off before I started teaching classes like this, in the sense that I didn't realize how ridiculously far south Russian colonialism went. You had even some Russian trapping activity going on down in California. And then I didn't realize how ridiculously far north Spanish colonialism went, with exploration activities going up all the way well into Canada and even into Alaskan territory. So you have 1775 Spanish contact, not kind of a true colonial outpost or anything, but some contact with Spanish explorers. Colonialism really gets going in Tlingit country, though, in 1799 with the establishment of the fort at the place known as Sitka. And this becomes sort of a center of operations for fur trading in this region. This area certainly is full of trapping resources as far as fur-bearing animals, and so it becomes a Russian outpost. Pretty quickly, the local Tlingit group, Kikshadi, becomes very unhappy with Fort Sitka being there, the Russian presence there, for a number of reasons. There was the fact that what initially appeared to be more of a trading relationship was becoming rapidly kind of more of a vassalage relationship. And what I mean by that is that the Russian trading companies saw themselves, even though they were economic force more so than a political force, they saw themselves as sort of outgrowths of and part of the Russian Empire. And they saw this as sort of them taking this into Russian Empire control. It should be, sort of owing allegiance to the Tsar. Long story short, they felt like Russian or Alaska Native people, Tlingit people in the area, were sort of subjects to the Tsar now and should be providing unpaid labor, as it was put in one source, or as we would actually call that, slave labor, right, for Russian trading companies. And so there was that. There was Russian male traders marrying Tlingit women. There was a lot of different things going on that really provoked animosity from the Kikshadi population. And so you had them then raid and take and sort of basically destroy the fort as a response to these factors. And it brings up the fact that we often don't realize. We tend to think of it as sort of overwhelming force from the European party versus the native party as far as numbers, right? That there were way more European colonizers than native people. That wasn't always the case. And in this case, you had a large enough Tlingit population that they were able to essentially kick the Russian outpost out. for 2 whole years, caused basically a retreat over to Kodiak Island. However, in 1804, you had what we all know as the Battle of Sitka, which I'll assume you know from your Alaska history class if you went to high school here. And that was where you had the Russian-American Company, as it was being called at that point, under Baranov, come and retake Sitka through 4 days of a bombardment of the area. And Tlingit people resisted that for several days, and then eventually decided that they should make a retreat. And they held a ceremony sort of honoring the Tlingit people that had defended the territory against an overwhelming outside force with cannons and things, but then they did retreat from the area. And that's how you get Sitka coming under Russian control again and eventually American control. 1835 to 1839, by the way, sees an epidemic of smallpox that, as we've talked about before, you had contagious diseases being passed by European colonizers through trading relationships, family relationships, other things. And as a result of that, that was oftentimes much greater numbers of casualties than the actual battles. We're not really sure how many native people passed and were killed during the Battle of Sitka. The number may have been relatively small. The number of people that were killed by the smallpox epidemics was incredibly large. And so it's important to recognize that when we're talking about the colonial histories, that it was often diseases that were drastically reducing native populations to the point where they could not effectively defend land territories against European forces. The smallpox epidemic also immediately preceded many Clingit people converting at the time to Russian Orthodoxy. So there may, although I've never heard this directly said this way, it's possible, it's likely that what happened there is similar to what happened with the Dena'ina, in the sense that when a group undergoes a very rapid and traumatic change in their society, they often look for different sorts of religious answers. And in this case, conversion to Russian Orthodoxy would have been a different sort of religious answer. And so if that ever seems like kind of strange to you, like why would a native nation adopt sort of the religion of the colonizers, as it were, especially within, a generation of the colonizing act, you need to understand sort of the way in which cultures respond to trauma and stress is often by seeking other ideologies or other cosmologies to situate the trauma and the historical events within. That's part of what's going on there. All right, well, that's kind of enough context on colonialism for now with this topic, but I want to talk about a specific event that happened, a very traumatic and tragic event, which is the bombardment, the attack, or as it's sometimes called, the bombing of Angoon. And so in October, so in the Furlow reading, Nancy Furlow, who is Clingit, talks about the fact that within the Angoon community, it is this event, even 120 years later, even in the 21st century, is still being talked about. As she says, you spend any time at all in Angoon, in this, which is a village of about 250 now at this point, I think. You spend any time at all there, and folks bring this up like regularly, generations later. And she says, I thought she kind of had a creative take on it in the sense that, she said it's very much part of American culture, this idea of, after we've been through traumatic events, we pick things up and we try to move forward. And so she says, outsiders might wonder sort of why are people still talking about this 120 years later? Well, for one thing, I would say that that's not always part of American culture, right? There are events which we choose proactively to always remember, from Pearl Harbor to September 11th, things like that. But I would also say that she kind of takes an interesting take on it by saying that there's a reason this attack still gets remembered. And it actually has a lot to do, surprisingly, with Clingit religious ideas. So we'll circle back around to that in a minute. So first, a little bit just about the event. In October 26th, 1882, you had the U.S. Navy, I'm forgetting the name of their commanding officer, but you had the U.S. Navy destroy the Clingit village of Angoon. And that's not sort of subjective or skewed. That's by their own records of the people that were there on both sides. And so you had 60 homes, roughly, that were just demolished, like just completely to the ground. You also had 6 children who were killed as a result of this bombardment. As far as we know, no Tlingit adults immediately died, but 6 children did from smoke inhalation as a result of this bombardment with cannons. This happened as a consequence of kind of a complicated series of events that the furlough reading talks about, but which I'll just kind of spell out for you again, just to make sure you understand it. So there was a shaman, a religious healer named Tlingit, a very important figure, as Iksh, or shaman healers, are within Clingit society traditionally, right? This would have been somebody in charge of healing. This would have been somebody in charge of contacting the spirits, a very important person, a revered person. So that person, Tlingit, died in a fishing accident while working for/with U.S. whalers. So they were using Clingit labor for whaling. And so he was killed in, from what I understand, like a harpoon accident. So in a sense, it was the American whaling company's fault, so to speak, right? It was a workplace accident when he was working for the Americans. And I'm not sure if it was an American that directly shot the harpoon or what the situation was, but it was regarded very much as sort of it was their fault. And now within Clingit society, traditionally, there is a traditional concept. So there's a couple of things going on, one of which Furlow talks about and one of which she doesn't directly talk about. So for one thing, there's a concept that everything kind of needs to be balanced, right? So for example, when somebody dies, the one half of the society throws a funeral potlatch, and then the other society sort of throws a balanced funeral potlatch as well, a memorial potlatch. So there's this constant emphasis in Tlingit society of balance and reciprocity. That was true even in the case of warfare. So you would sometimes have interclan warfare, or at least it's called warfare. We might better think of it as sort of feuding, because it would go on like even within a village. But oftentimes it could only end if somebody had been killed. There would then be kind of feuding back and forth between two parties, and it would only end when there was like proper compensation given to the family who had lost a loved one. Or occasionally a person actually had to die, like another person of equivalent rank. And she talks about the fact in the reading that sometimes too, like traditional fishing territories would be owned by a specific family, and that if somebody violated that and fished in somebody else's territory, historically before colonialism, that could even result in like an execution. So there's this common sense of balance, that the scales had to be balanced. There's this sort of reciprocity, and that's what tied the system together and kept it together, was this constant balancing act. And so when Tlingit was killed in an American whaling operation that was viewed as sort of the Americans' fault, Clingit people, as their own oral storytelling says, viewed this as sort of this, well, so they viewed this as sort of, this needs to be compensated for. And so they demanded from the American whalers 200 blankets, which is a source of blankets, is kind of a system of wealth, almost a currency in many of the Pacific coastal groups in this area. So they demanded 200 blankets as sort of compensation, might be one way of putting it, or just balancing for the fact that we've lost this really important person in our society. And, normally that would have been kind of a straightforward thing if it had been another Clingit person, but because it was American people, you were kind of speaking across a cultural divide. So I think that's part of the reason that in addition to demanding the blankets, they took 2 of the whalers hostage and took 2 boats hostage as kind of a way of making their point of like, we mean business in our culture, right? We really do demand that you compensate for the fact that we lost a loved one. So they take 2 hostages and they take 2 whaling boats. They also paint their faces black, which from their perspective is because they're getting ready for a mourning ceremony that involves painting their faces black. They also stop working, all of them in the whole community of Angoon stop working for the whaling company. What's happening is that they're getting ready for potlatch. They're getting ready for a funeral service. And these are very specific funeral practices that have to take place while they're honoring a dead person. But the way that's perceived and the way that's read by the whaling company and thus by the U.S. Navy is that, oh, they're being hostile. They're refusing now to work on the jobs that they were just working on. They're all gathering together, acting strange, painting their faces black, and what the heck, they just took hostages, and they're demanding blankets from us, 200 blankets. And so this then leads to a situation where you have a U.S. Navy ship which comes to Angoon to resolve what they see as sort of native aggression from their perspective, and they actually demand payment from the Clingit instead. The Clingit aren't able to pay everything that they're demanded, and long story short, the U.S. naval ship with cannons attacks Angoon and destroys Angoon. And again, the result is the entire city is demolished, all the plank houses, and then 6 children die. And also it's the middle of winter, and you've just wiped out the food storage that they had gathered up for the winter. And so you've left people homeless and foodless on a beach, basically, with no homes. So in the middle of an Alaska winter, even in Southeast Alaska, that's just not good at all. And so this is a really traumatic historical event, right? And we can think about this isn't the term Furlow uses, but it's one I'm going to use. We can think about this in terms of collective memory and collective trauma. So social scientists and anthropologists recognize that societies possess collective memory. And what we mean by that is not that people are some sort of weird children of the corn thing where they all think together or something. But what we mean by that is that we have a collective memory in this, or a cultural memory is the way we sometimes say this, in the sense that events that happen to us, events that happen to an entire group can kind of become embedded in their popular consciousness. And we talk about cultural or collective trauma when we're talking about specifically painful, tragic events. So something like Pearl Harbor, right? Americans are sort of never going to forget the event of Pearl Harbor. It doesn't mean that we can't later have an alliance with the nation of Japan, as indeed we do currently. It just means that that's always sort of an event that's in American memory. Right? So collective memory, collective trauma, and Angoon, the bombing of Angoon, is very much a collective trauma for Tlingit people. The difference here might be, though, that most of us sort of don't bring up Pearl Harbor in everyday conversation, whereas the bombing of Angoon still gets brought up all the time if you're walking around Angoon by Tlingit people. And so Furlow situates this within Tlingit religious ideas. So I thought she did a really interesting, fascinating job of sort of laying out some important Clingit ideas, specifically the idea of balance and the idea that the way things were established from the very beginning of time is that humans, the natural world and the spiritual world, are sort of in this balancing act where they have these webs, as she puts it, I think, these bounded relationships, which I liked that way of putting it, right? There's bounds around the relationship. There's rules that have to be followed. As she points out, the root word for religion in Latin is religare, which means to tie together again or to bind together again. And very much Tlingit religion was about binding things together, binding humans, spirits, and nature together, but with very specific protocols that had to be followed. And that was true also within Tlingit society, that there had to be sort of balance, that was what the universe was made up of. So, for example, you have the moiety system, where essentially the society is divided into half, with wolf and raven clan, or eagle and raven, wolf and eagle and moiety. And when one moiety throws a funeral potlatch for somebody that's died, the other throws a memorial potlatch. When one moiety says something significant to the other one doesn't leave them hanging or let the words hang in space, as they say, but instead needs to respond to them. So when one group takes a meaningful social action to another, the other group has to respond. That's part of sort of maintaining balance in the universe, both the social universe and the broader cosmic universe. So it was important, it was really, really important after the death of their shaman that there be funeral practices that are part of sort of balancing the scales and bringing about sort of a closing of the loop and a closure and a balance. But they only sort of got partway through the funeral practices before the Navy destroyed the city, and they weren't able to complete the the series of potlatches that would go along with somebody's prominent dying. And so, in a sense, somebody was never properly laid to rest, which is, of course, always a tragedy. But perhaps even more so, the cosmos, the social cosmos, was sort of never laid to rest. The balance was never properly achieved. Not only that, but an attack happened, a really serious attack. And for century, that was never really balanced either, right? It was just an attack that devastated them and was never really fully balanced. It's a sort of an act without balance, the universe left hanging. There was eventually a cash settlement of, I think it's $90,000 from U.S. Congress in the 1980s as compensation for what had happened. It was, widely viewed by pretty much everybody as a terrible event that had happened because of an overzealous military leader that was misinterpreting what was going on the island. But there's never been a formal apology from the U.S. Navy, which is something that the community has continued to ask for and just hasn't had yet. And so it still feels like, sort of closure hasn't happened, balance hasn't happened. Because when there's something like a feud within Tlingit society, traditionally you would balance it, right? You would end it with a formal apology and compensation. But here you have sort of some of that, right? Some compensation, but not like a formal apology, not a true balance, not a true closure. All of this brings up the criticalness of cultural context as we're trying to understand why people in this small community still bring up the bombing. Not just every once in a while, but all the time, very often, as Furlow points out. We have to understand religious concepts. We have to understand the importance of balance and reciprocity, of giving and taking back and forth, and how reciprocity was shattered when they weren't able to finish the sort of reciprocal funeral practices for the shaman, but also when an attack was made but never sort of fully reciprocated back. And it's in that context that we have to understand this trauma. So I think this shows how a community can change so much, right? Folks are wearing, button-ups and hanging out in a house with interior lighting, right? Folks, of course, live in the 21st century. And yet at the same time, our cultural values that go back to time immemorial still shape us so much of who we are as peoples. And that's certainly the case with Angoon Clingit people. I also wanted to pull out a concept that Furlow talks about in the reading as well. I don't have a ton to say about it. I just thought it was a really powerful quote that I wanted to share. In the context of talking about Angoon, she also said something really interesting about the origin stories of Tlingit people. And she says, "The story must begin with Raven. Raven created the Tlingit world, and the Raven stories tell us how Raven's cunning made our world what it is today, how he stole the sun, moon, and stars and brought light to the world, or how waters dripping from his beak became our rivers and lakes." So we see here a trend that you sometimes see in other Native American societies of sacred characters from time immemorial who shaped the landscape through their actions, in this case the water dripping from Raven's beak. We see also a being that we often call, sort of when these stories, when people talk about Raven in, let's say, like if you learned about it in grade school, like, oh, Native Americans consider Raven to be a trickster. Well, that's not really like a proper encompassing of who Raven is for Tlingit people. Raven is a creator being. And yes, there's sort of tricky things he does. He engages in theft, right? But he does so to get people the sun, the moon, and the stars. And so he's a creator being, an important kind of creator being. So there's some chaos there, but there's also a lot of creation, and Raven is to be honored for that. It then says, the Raven stories highlight a time when the boundaries between the human and natural worlds and worlds of the spirits were fluid, and communication and exchanges took place easily. We're sort of seeing echoes, even though there's such different cultures, we're sort of seeing echoes here of Gwich'in stories that we talked about last time. She goes on, even though communication between these realms is no longer as direct, it remains very important. The world is a spiritual world, a sensible feeling world. Strict rules guide behavior between the human, natural, and spiritual worlds. So I want you to kind of try to get inside that headspace a little bit of sort of classic Tlingit supernatural teachings and the way in which the world is sort of thought as this animated place in which one's own actions have reverberations for the natural world, but also one in which back in the beginning, sort of there was a lot of fluidity between the animal world, the spirit world, and the human world, and kind of think about how that might cause one to think about not just historical events like Angoon, but events in general. And I would say that these kind of teachings, even after a group has sort of largely converted to Christianity, I think a lot of these teachings still influence and guide how people think about the natural world. So we'll talk in a little bit about Clingit fishing practices and how those reflect some of these ideas.